Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all of you who are joining us this afternoon for our Hispanic Heritage Month program. My name is Judah Leggett, and I teach history here at Northeast Lakeview College, and I'm also the co-chair of the History and Heritage Committee that is hosting this event. So our panel discussion today is titled Commodification and Authenticity in Hispanic Cultural Celebrations. Each year in the US, the observation of Hispanic Heritage Month begins on September 15th and extends to October 15th. September 15 is the anniversary of independence for Latin American countries, including Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Mexico and Chile celebrate their Independence Days on September 16 and 18. So during this month-long observance, we celebrate the histories, the stories, the cultures, and the contributions of those whose ancestors came from Spain, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central and South America. And so in observance of Hispanic Heritage Month, we've organized this event, and today we have two educators joining us whose work and expertise centers on Latin American history and culture. So our first panelist who will be speaking to us today is Dr. Alexandria Castillo. And Dr. Castillo is an adjunct professor with the NLC History Department. She received her master's and doctoral degrees in Latin American history from the University of Houston. And her research centers on the roles of race, gender, and religion during the Spanish colonization of Mexico. It specifically focuses on non-Spanish groups' experiences with the colonial Mexican church and the church's role in constructing social concepts such as race and gender within colonial society. And our next panelist is Lucian Lopez. Lucian holds a master's degree in history from UTSA and a master's degree in theology from St. John's University in Minnesota. He has spent the last 10 years teaching high school and middle school Spanish, philosophy, theology, and ESL in Minnesota. And so we're happy to have both of you join us today. And we'll begin with a short presentation by Dr. Castillo.
All right, hello everyone. I'm glad that you are all here. Very important topic. So as you know, the title for this panel discussion was Commodification and Authenticity in Hispanic Cultural Celebrations. So when we started planning this discussion, we were talking about the concept of Hispanic cultural influences and the act of sharing one's culture with others and the inherent kind of boundary between subject and viewer, which led to this kind of broader discussion of authenticity in that act. So I thought a good place to start would be to consider something like tourism, because that's a kind of medium through which many people get exposed to different cultures, different places, different people. So what I wanted to talk about today, and I am going to share my screen, so a PowerPoint presentation, okay? So I'm going to share my screen. Visual aids are always helpful, at least my students think so. So let me go ahead and share that. Okay, let me make it full screen as well. Okay, so my kind of little presentation is called Selling Paradise Tourism in Latin America. Now, what I wanted to talk about, of course, more broadly, kind of set the scene, for thinking tourism in Latin America. I have a nifty little map here giving you an idea of how, what is the contribution, how much, what is the role that tourism plays in these countries' economies. So this was provided, I got this from the World Travel and Tourism Council, which does these kind of big research and statistics, but an important component of Latin American economy that has experienced considerable growth in the last couple of decades is tourism. And, kind of thinking of history though, we saw that the tourism industry in Latin America kind of took a hit in the late 80s and 90s because of the war on drugs and kind of the violence associated with that. But tourism has steadily increased in recent years. We saw a little bit of a dip in 2008, 2009 with the US recession. And then we saw it again with the COVID restrictions, right? But steady growth in the tourism industry over the long term, and there's forecasts suggest continued growth. For example, as you can see here, Latin America, at least 8% of the total GDP contributed by tourism and travel in 2018. Now, this is kind of a overview, and as you can see, Mexico, for example, is included in North America, but for example, for Mexico, tourism accounted for 17% of the economy in 2018. As far as jobs go, in Mexico in 2018, tourism directly employed more than 2.3 million people. 6% of the total employment opportunities in Mexico were connected to the tourism industry. So it's something that's really worth considering as far as the country's histories and developments themselves. But I also wanted to talk about some interesting types of tourism. Okay, this growth might not be in what you would expect. And they have a lot kind of correlation with what we're going to be talking about as far as the influence and active sharing culture. So one really big example would be ecotourism. This has kind of jumped off on the recent years, has become very, very popular. A huge kind of growing niche market for tourism. Now, if you haven't heard this term before, ecotourism, it's the idea of seeking out natural areas with low level of development, searching for this kind of pristine, untouched areas, and emphasis on vacationing with the lowest environmental impact. So there is some, a good part of it is dedicated to sustainability and these kinds of broader environmental concerns. But it's also for thinking about how does this work as far as travel goes? Well, hotels with no central air, limited plumbing, food is sourced locally. And it's interesting because on the other side of this, on the other side of the coin, you have this focus on sustainability and limiting environmental impact has some unintended consequences. For example, this will inevitably increase costs of these locations, these tourist destinations and lodging and all these kinds of things because of that emphasis on sustainability. And because these costs have increased, it has now kind of elevated this type of tourism into this luxury class of tourism, which means that it is relatively off limits to vast groups, different socioeconomic groups. So is it the savior of tourism that it is being kind of framed to be? And then also getting to these areas required local guides, and this was profession of locals in the area. But these rural or indigenous guides, their livelihoods have actually become threatened because in order to meet these standards of being associated with sustainable ecotourism that has set by these various countries' governments, they need to take specific training programs. And oftentimes they cannot get to these programs because they're held within the main city limits or the capital. So there is some unexpected consequences here, but I just wanted to take a moment to really appreciate how this has changed the way that these countries market tourism to outsiders. So these are taken from various websites, tourism websites, and just see the difference. And also the lack of things that are in these images, and how this has kind of evolved, maybe outsider perspectives of what Latin America really looks like, which I think is really important when we're thinking about cultural influence, sharing culture, exposure to culture, right? Another one that I wanted to talk about that I think is really fascinating because it has exploded in the last couple years is wellness tourism. Wellness tourism, the travel is defined as the travel for the purpose of promoting health and well-being through physical, psychological, or spiritual activities. Now, Latin America and the Caribbean, according to the Global Wellness Tourism Congress, revealed that wellness tourism in Latin America increased from about $30 billion spent by foreigners on wellness tourism in 2015 to over 34 billion in just 2 years later. So this is a really growing industry. And I wanted to read a quote from the chairman of the Global Wellness Institute, because she specifically talks about Latin America. And I wanted you to listen to her description. And when we're thinking about this concept of authenticity, right? She was quoted saying, quote, "From Mexico to all across Central and South America, this is an exciting wellness travel growth story to watch. The region has a unique resource that's increasingly precious to our world. Extensive, unspoiled nature and extraordinary destinations that marry eco, adventure, and nature with wellness and spa," end quote. Okay. So a good example here, these images are from resorts or wellness hotels in Tulum, Mexico. This has become an incredibly vibrant yogi destination over recent years. The image to the left, I wanted to talk about, it's from a website called essentialtulum.com. It's where you can, as someone interested in a yoga retreat, can go and book these hotels. The caption for this one is the Ecotourism Tulum Hotel. And it says, quote, "Need some extra mystical boost to recharge your intuitive self? Then you have to take your yoga practice close to the Mayan ruins. This is where you'll find the Ecotourism Hotel, an amazing beachfront deck transformed into an outdoor yoga shala, and it's designed resembling a place for ancient Maya rituals." So utilizing this concept of Maya ritual as a way to market a yoga experience, okay? Again, we're talking about authenticity, so we're adding another layer here to our discussion. But very important to local, for thinking about generation of revenue, right? That's wellness tourism. Let's talk, last but not least, really kind of transitioning to our discussion of today, would be cultural tourism. Okay, cultural tourism. Now, the United Nations World Tourism Organization defines cultural tourism as a type of tourism activity in which the visitor's motivation is to experience and consume the tangible and intangible cultural attractions or products in a tourism destination, end quote. So I wanted to talk about this program as utilizing Mexico as kind of my little case study, because that is what I focus on in my research. This program called Pueblos Mágicos, so magical towns. This is a program that was initiated by the Mexican Ministry of Tourism, okay? And these towns are recognized by the Mexican government for their, quote, magical qualities. So this designation is awarded to communities that have maintained things like original architecture, traditions, culture. Their locations have some kind of great relevance to the country's history as a whole. And so the Pueblo Mágico program was created by Mexico's Ministry of Tourism in 2001. Currently, there are 132 towns with this designation as a magical town, okay? Now, these are just a couple of screenshots, not all of them, but some screenshots taken from the Visit Mexico website, the official website for the tourism Ministry of Tourism. So this process would be the first step was you have to have at least 5,000 people in your town and be within relatively easy reach of a major city, okay? That's kind of the criteria there. So within 300 kilometers from a major city, you have to have things like a certain level of infrastructure. And then once you have that, the Pueblo Mágico Committee can then send in their application to the Ministry of Tourism to receive said designation. And if they do this, right, if many apply, but those that have achieved it, the benefits for the town, what are the benefits for the town? This distinction means that their town would be able to utilize broader marketing from the Ministry of Tourism. So think about that, right? Many of these are off the beaten path. They are not a typical tourist destination. Some are not. And so they could potentially benefit from this broader exposure, utilizing the ministry's being on this list of magical towns. And here, this was screenshot. So if you go to the visitmexico.com website and you click on one of these pictures, it'll send you to a page specific on that magical town. And it'll show you about what's to do there, what are the lodging, guided tours, all these kinds of things. So that's an incredible marketing platform. These towns, once they get this distinction, also get certain government funding to maintain said attractions. So that's also kind of an added incentive to get this designation. So I have, some things that I wanted us to kind of touch on and talk about, but this kind of sets the scene for if we want to have a later discussion as well about this concept of authenticity. We have these booming and growing tourist industries, and we do have this underlying, concept of things like untouched, natural, authentic experiences. But then the question becomes, if culture is packaged for consumers, i.e. for sale, right? Can it be considered a truly authentic representation of said culture? So like I said, I think I'm done with my 20 minutes, but we can go to the next presenter. But it's kind of just get the intellectual juices flowing, so we can have that discussion a bit later.
Thank you. That is a great question to end on. Is this an authentic cultural experience if it is packaged or staged? This concept of staged authenticity for tourists. Are we experiencing authentic culture? And then also, we could go into a deeper discussion on. You brought up the effects of this cultural tourism for the people who live in those areas, for the Indigenous communities. So I think that is a great segue over to Lucian's discussion on the cultural anthropology. Oh, yes, stop the share on the cultural anthropology of the Calavera. And I believe you can share your screen, Lucian.
All right, thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to talk today about calaveras. So first thing, this segues very nicely, and in the end, I'm going to be asking the same question. As Ms. Leggett mentioned, as Judah mentioned, I lived in San Antonio most of my life. I grew up here, and then I lived in Minnesota for a few years. So there's been a bit of a journey there. And I want to do something kind of similar. I want to look at the journey of the calavera through history. But really through my history. I'm going to tell a couple of stories. And the first thing that I think is important to make sure is that we understand as I'm talking that culture is the way I'm talking about is nothing more than people. Culture is is people and what's in people's head and what people experience with their eyes and their ears with the five senses. Their culture doesn't exist on its own like some God or something, it's just people. And so we're going to look at that. So the question that I want to ask is calaveras and chipotles when I'm conscious of culture. So I'm actually not going to talk about chipotles that much. I just have one little story to tell about chipotles, and it's mostly to complain, and then I'll talk about calaveras. So chipotles. So we all know what a chipotle pepper is, don't we? When I was a kid, I thought I was the only person in the world that knew what a chipotle was or a calavera. And the chipotle pepper was my mother's secret ingredient in her refried beans, in her frijoles refritos. And it was delicious. It was a winner. Then somewhere, I don't know, 2002, 2003, everybody knew what a chipotle was. And now we've got chain restaurants called Chipotle. And suddenly my mother's secret ingredient has been exposed, and what can you do? Similarly, I'd like to tell the story of my experience with calaveras. So when I was a kid, my dad was born in Mexico City. He never became an American citizen. He also died there. And my mom is gringa from Alabama. And so I went to Mexico often, and I was obsessed with sugar skulls. I was obsessed with calaveras, and every time I went, that's all I wanted. And you couldn't find them. You couldn't find them anywhere except in the mercado in October, and not even the whole month of October, just really close to Dia de los Muertos. And this is what they looked like. They were made out of sugar, but you didn't eat them because they had glue in them. And you put the name of someone that was deceased on the front of it. And it was part of the ritual of Dia de los Muertos. And suddenly we live in a culture where you can go to Michael's and there's Dia de los Muertos stuff. You can go to HEB, you can go to Walgreens, you can go everywhere online, year round, everywhere. That's my experience of Dia de los Muertos. It was something that was very obscure, and then it became something that you see everywhere. And even before I experienced the calavera, it had its history. It was a part of a celebration that happened in rural communities of mostly indigenous people that had a deep-seated belief that at this time of the year, the veil was thin, and the people that had crossed over would come back and would be able to spend time with you and experience their favorite foods and the people that they had been with before, the people they'd lived with. Well, that's not my experience. And in fact, when I went to Mexico, it was made clear to me, my family did not practice altar de muertos. It was something that happened in rural communities, mostly among indigenous people, but it was still something that was meaningful to me. After my father died, I continued to put up an altar de muertos. And it was very meaningful for me because I would put things that reminded me of different people that had passed away. For my grandfather, for example, I'd always put a rose because my abuela and my abuelo, when he wasn't the best husband in the world, but my grandmother would always say, nobody saw how we would dance the tango in the kitchen in the morning before everybody woke up. So on the altar, I put a rose to remember my abuelo and how he would dance the tango with my grandma, who is now in heaven with him, or who's now dead, and maybe they will come back and visit together. Or for my cousin Alejandro, who died, I would leave a cigarette. Or for my father, I would leave his brown wallet or his gold chains or something that reminded me of him, or the piece of his grave that I kept. And these things were always very meaningful to me. And so, I don't know, I want us to look at that, and I want us to look at how the calavera has evolved over the years. The question I want to ask is, what happens when it becomes conscious? What happens when it's something that we're experiencing and we're living as part of our culture, and then suddenly we're aware of it? And so I want to look at a story that's very famous by Alice Walker. She wrote The Color Purple, if you're familiar with that. And she also wrote a short story that I read when I was a first-year college student called The Quilt. And it's a story about two sisters, Black sisters, African-American sisters, and there's a quilt that's been passed down from generation to generation. The one sister's in college, and she writes mom and says, I want this quilt for my dorm room because it represents my African-American heritage. And the other sister wants the quilt because she's cold, and because it's cozy, and because it's warm. And what this story tries to express is what happens when our culture moves from this place of automatic behavior that we can't necessarily even explain, it's just how we live our life, to something we're aware of. I'm aware of Dia de los Muertos. I'm aware of the calavera. And I'm especially aware of it now in an era when most Mexican kids now, many are getting their first exposure to Dia de los Muertos from Disney, from Coco, or from the Book of Life, or from something like that. It's been taken up. So there's two things that I will argue happen when culture becomes conscious. Well, culture doesn't become conscious. People become conscious of their culture. And those two things are this. The first is, well, it's no longer unconscious. That's pretty simple. When culture becomes conscious, when we're conscious of cultural elements, it's no longer part of our unconscious. It's no longer part of that deeper part of us. Is that significant? Is that important? Especially for what causes our behavior. Okay, so I'm going to have to take a little bit of a philosophical and psychological turn for a minute, and I hope it won't be too painful. And I want to talk about what we mean by the unconscious. And of course, there's all kinds of explanations. The original idea of the unconscious was very mystical and weird, and it was that the majority of our soul, like the bottom of an iceberg, is unseen and unknown and mysterious, and that's where the majority of stuff happens. And the only stuff at the tip is what we're aware of. It's what we see. It's what the sunlight hits. It's what we're conscious of. What we're not conscious of, we can't put into words. It's the language of dreams. It's the language of symbol. Okay? When a cultural object moves into consciousness, we're aware of it and we can analyze it and we can look at it. But before that, we can't do that. It's just what is behind our behavior. And psychology tries to tackle this as well. In fact, modern psychologists are thinking the subconscious might not even be that complicated. It could be something as simple as you don't need all the stuff you know all the time. You just need what you need for that moment. Right now, to give this presentation, I just need to be able to see my screen and to remember my notes, and that's it. I don't need to remember what's in my refrigerator or what my mom's worrying about right now. That's not what I need. That goes in the subconscious. But the thing is, more and more stuff goes in your subconscious. And some stuff you haven't accessed for years. You haven't needed it, but it's in there. Okay. So the first thing that happens is the stuff goes from the subconscious to the conscious. You see it. So you're aware of it. That's pretty obvious. But what does that mean? And I'm not going to draw too many conclusions. I just want you to think about what happens when it becomes exposed. The other thing that happens when it becomes exposed is that other people can see it. And it's open for analysis. And there are two ways in which people can respond. One is cultural appreciation, and one is cultural appropriation. So let's talk a little bit about what those differences could be. Cultural appreciation is just that. It's all about connecting to people. It's about wanting to know people, about wanting to know their culture, and wanting to know more. And that can be awkward, and it's important. It needs to happen. And cultural appropriation, of course, is where people are using another culture for their own ends. And I think this connects so well to what Dr. Castillo was talking about, in the sense that what purpose is the culture being exploited for? For money, for tourism, for capitalism, for colonization, for what purposes? But cultural appreciation can also be painful. And it's important not to get them confused, because if someone's sincerely and authentically wanting to get to know you and wanting to get to know your culture, and we shut them down and say they're racist because it may be awkward or uncomfortable, could really burn some bridges. And I need to see what the time is because I don't want to go too much over. Okay. So living in Minnesota, I have a couple of stories about that. And so I just kind of wanted to go there. So I decided I wanted to bring the Altar de Muertos to Minnesota, to a community of mostly German descent, white people. And Minnesota is very different from Texas. Well, you can't find a bean and cheese taco to save your life. But also the people are generally pretty liberal, open-minded. They don't want to be racist. They're anti-racist. And I found that sometimes it's even more uncomfortable dealing with that because they're a little bit afraid to bother you. Oh, I don't want to talk to the Mexicans because I don't want to bother them. And so it was a bit of an uphill battle, but it was beautiful to watch local people engage with the Altar de Muertos. First, they would be afraid. They'd say, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to mess it up. It's not my culture. I feel like I'm going to ruin it. But then I would see them start to put pictures up of people that they'd lost. And I'd see them get to grieve. And I'd see them kind of enjoy the hospitality that they've never really offered their dead loved ones before, and the hospitality that I would offer them. And before you knew it, I had lots of pictures of German descent people on my altar de muertos. And I felt very good about that. But it was a tough struggle. So I guess what I want to leave us with is that thought of what happens when culture becomes conscious. There's a new way you can deal with it. And I think the difficult thing is, whether you're talking about psychology or you're talking about culture, we have seen stuff go from the unconscious to the conscious. We've seen stuff come to light and then be able to analyze it and look at it, but we haven't figured out how to make stuff go in the other direction. But the thing to remember is we all have a culture, we all have an ethnicity. No one can take it away from us because we can't even put it into words. It's in dream language and we have it and we live with it every day and it evolves. And so that's what I want to leave us with, is just kind of a thought of how do we draw the line between cultural appropriation, cultural appreciation, and what happens to our own culture as we begin to share it and we begin to experience other people's. So thank you so much for letting me speak today.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to invite anyone who's present, if you have a question, please place your questions in the chat and we'll address them. So you've both left us with a few important questions to think about. And I'm wondering if we can tie in the question, Dr. Castillo, that you left us with, to what extent is our cultural celebration authentic when it has been packaged, right? And that applies to the tourism that you were discussing, as well as the celebration of Dia de los Muertos and the Sugar Skull. Are we authentically experiencing tourism? Are we authentically celebrating Dia de los Muertos if we are consuming it in this commodified package? What are your thoughts on that?
I want to share when we're talking about kind of my experience, a friend of mine who's also Mexican American, we went on a trip together, kind of around Riviera Maya area. We just wanted to explore all the cenotes that we could. They're amazing. If you haven't gone to them, they're just gorgeous. Little just pockets of fresh water and caves, and it's just lovely. So we were doing that, and I was not aware of the fact that Tulum had become such a yogi destination. She knew that, I did not. And so when we got there, by and large, we were staying in the part of town that, to me, has been my experience with small little Mexican pueblos. I mean, it was pretty normal. And so, but her friend was actually in town and she was staying at one of these yoga retreats. So we went to that part of the area, went that part of the town, and it was a quite jarring experience because you go down this road, it's along the beach, and all of a sudden it feels like you're in a different place. It does not feel like you are in Mexico anymore, by and large, because you don't see really any locals. It's just tourists, and these hotels are kind of straight out of, some resort in Southern California. I mean, that's what they look like. The stores look like that. So it was a very odd experience. So I think in that regard, that's one of those instances of maybe utilizing a space, repackaging it, and then still trying to sell it as an authentic experience. That's the danger, because it's very much not. It's one of those things, if people said, oh yeah, I've been to Mexico. Well, did you leave the resort? Okay, so have you been to Mexico? Those kind of things. I think that's the issue. But learning more about this Pueblo Mágico program, I can see the benefits, because these off the beaten path communities, they're not going to have access to this marketing. I mean, it's marketing 101. Someone cannot purchase what you're selling unless they know you're selling it, right? So I see the benefits there. It's hard. It's a difficult thing that I think we need to struggle with. I think if you just say that, oh, it's fine, there's nothing wrong, it's completely no barriers whatsoever, then you're not appreciating that culture unless you appreciate that this may have some layers to it. But if you just take it and say, oh, everything's fine, are you really appreciating what's happening, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I can't stop thinking about the movie Happy Feet. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's, the penguins, they're about to be taken over and turned into a tourist resort. But one of them can dance and suddenly teaches all of them to dance so that they don't get basically destroyed. And so they're dancing for the colonizers. And that's the feeling I get a lot with this, is that we as Mexican people or Colombian people or Cuba or whatever, we've learned how to dance to make them come and give us money. And we've learned what their favorite dances are. Is that authentic?
I was fascinated a few years ago to learn the extent to which that was what happened here with the creation of our national parks, right? In the large part, our national parks were these, kind of commodified pieces of wilderness where indigenous communities were removed to create the wilderness for tourists to come and enjoy, right? So this is happening, on a broad global scale. So if you could talk a little bit more about that difference between appropriation and appreciation, because that's something that I think we really struggle with. Like, you were drawing some lines on, it's appropriation if you're using it, for maybe a selfish type of ends. But could you speak a little bit more to how we know where that line is and if we're appropriating someone's culture or appreciating it?
Absolutely. I think that first of all, the line will never be super clear. It'll never be super clear because we're operating in a system in which there's a majority culture and there are minorities. But I can tell you a story. So when I was in Minnesota, one of the women I worked with at the School of Theology was very confused that my last name was Lopez, but that I had light colored skin. And so she came up to me and we had a very awkward conversation where she said, so you're Lopez, your dad must have been very, and she couldn't even finish saying white because she knew she was, stepping in dangerous territory. And I said, well, no, actually, he was very dark. And she said, oh, well, then your mom must have been very white. And I said, yes, actually, she was. And it was a very uncomfortable moment for me because part of me was getting angry because you can be any skin color and be Hispanic. I have a cousin whose dad is Chinese. Her name is Lucian Lopez. And she only speaks Spanish and she's only lived in Mexico. She's Mexican, she's Hispanic. But people need to ask some questions to sort stuff out. And it doesn't mean they're racist. It means they're trying to connect with you. And that's important. And I think it's important to realize when that's happening or when someone's actually insulting you and hurting your feelings. Another incident we had, it was a mostly, German descent, white campus, all boys. They had a big kegger party that was Cinco de Mayo themed. And the Latino community was furious because it was just a bunch of white guys getting drunk in Mexican hats and serapes and, acting like jerks. So there's a difference. There's a difference.
Thank you. There is a difference, right? And I think we see that a lot, like headlines of college students and high school students engaging in that type of behavior. So I again want to remind anyone, if you do have a question, you can place it in the chat. If this conversation has sparked some curiosities for you, or just triggered anything that you'd like to ask, please place that in the chat. And then some of you have already sent me your banner IDs. That's great. So if you still need to send that to me, please do. So is there anything else that you would like to touch on? Yes, Dr. Castillo.
So what I was interested to see what other people thought, because this is something that I kind of go back and forth on as well. So if I could I share my screen as a previous slide that I had? Okay, let me get back to it. And I just want to see what y'all think, if I can, if it will let me. Not this one, this one. Okay. So this concept of ecotourism, right? It's the idea that we're going to marry tourism with environmental sustainability, but a key part of that is utilizing local Indigenous population as far as having them be the benefit of this new, they're being able to profit off of and see the profits more so than, say, the government itself, but the actual local communities. So I was wondering, for those, everybody that's been listening and looking at this, when you look at these images, and you feel free to put it in the chat if that's easier, right? But when you look at these images, what kind of impression does this give you of these particular countries, right? What is the image that you have of these countries? And we can kind of start from there and considering, are these really accurate depictions of these countries? And where does that line lie, right?
Yeah, so if you'd like to share in the chat some words or phrases that come to mind, one that comes to mind for me is, I think you had used it before, pristine, right? It's just incredibly pristine. You said retreat, right? So we're going to retreat into these luxurious spaces, peaceful in nature.
Untouched. I like that you used the word untouched.
Mm-hmm.
Can I speak real fast and
Yes.
just give my thoughts? I mean, so I am basically Afro-Latina, but multiracial, right? And so it's like this in these types of countries and in African countries, very underdeveloped. Again, like you said, that untouched feel, but underdeveloped to a point where it doesn't look like society has reached these areas. And it's so untrue.
And I think that's one of the great ironies of ecotourism, is because if these areas were untouched, if they were unspoiled, unsullied, we wouldn't need ecotourism, right? We wouldn't need to have this great initiative to try and protect it. And it also gives this impression that in order to appreciate these places, you shouldn't interact with locals because locals aren't there. It doesn't look like it from these pictures, right? It's something that as a tourist, you're going in with this plan to go into a wilderness, quote unquote, right? Go into these areas that are untouched by people, but then doesn't that create a barrier between you and those people that live there?
It's like saying you can have
difficult.
it, nobody's using it.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, and when you were talking, I thought about like the people that'll go to the Temple of the Sun in Mexico City on the solstice, and you know, a bunch of tourists from Europe and the United States and whatever, and the indigenous people that are the actual descendants of the ones that knew how to use the temple are begging, and they're not in the posters.
No, they're not. No, they're not. Exactly. Exactly.
That's a good point. And in the chat, there's that question, where are the people, right?
Where are the people? Exactly.
The idea is that you're going to go into this pristine, natural, peaceful environment and not have to interact with the locals.
Mm-hmm. And when I read that the study on how this impacted the employment of the local Indigenous guides that were typically the ones that would take tourists into these locations, But now that they have these new standards of sustainability, ecotourism, you have, in order to get that nice label, right, of ecotourist or ecotourism attraction, you have to have this certain level of training. Well, now that the groups that have been doing these guided tours for many years, now their access to this training is limited. So it's kind of pushing them out of something that they used to use as a source of income. But again, a key aspect of ecotourism is utilizing locals and having the locals, indigenous populations, be the ones on the benefiting end of these ecotourism developments. So that's something that I struggle with as far as, I mean, I definitely support sustainability and all of these kinds of things, but when it comes to the real human impact, that's something that I kind of struggle with. And I wanted to see what y'all thought about that.
And if anybody does want to unmute and, you know, share your thought on this, you're welcome to. You have the option to unmute.
Well, I'll go ahead and stop my share if we don't get it up anymore. There we go.
So the locals are effectively being pushed out of that industry because of this requirement for the specialized training. Who is replacing them in that?
So from what I understand, technically, these would be either, because private companies have come in, and because they have the money, they have the funding, they can do the things like the infrastructure, how to get to these places, right? The locals don't have that money to put into it. These private companies will come in, and they do have things like carbon purchasing and these types of, which there's debate and if that's really an effective way of sustainability. So they will then provide this training in conjunction with the government, but their locations, and they're not necessarily going to indigenous locals and saying, hey, do you want to participate in this? Can you participate in this? It's more of those who are able to do that. So I think in that just kind of not so subtle way of discrimination between locals versus those that are maybe in more of the city areas, more that have better connections, more access, things that, you know, we definitely have understand, right?
Thank you. And I see we have a hand up, Crystal.
Sorry, my mute kept going down. I have a question on that specifically. What are some of the protections that some of the locals are using to gain access or try to prevent you know, companies from coming in and taking over like their tourist attractions or their you know, their markets and things like that?
Unfortunately, they can be in really difficult positions, right? Because a lot of times these private companies do have very entrenched connections with the local government. So it's much easier for them to kind of edge out if we're thinking about purchasing rights and so forth. So a friend of mine, she works in environmental protection. She works with this thing that what I mentioned, carbon purchasing. And that's one of the biggest issues that she struggles with, is that these private, and she works for a private company. That's their role, is to a business comes to them and says, hey, we need to construct this new hotel somewhere or whatever. And we want to do it in an eco-friendly way via carbon purchasing. And so her company describes, how do we do this? Well, one of the what they're charged with doing is working with local Indigenous communities. And so these companies, hers included, she has confessed to this, they have made these promises to work with the local Indigenous, like, we will protect your interests, we will make sure that you're a part of this equation. But when it gets to a point where it's just about the bottom line, that part of the deal tends to be the last one that gets the box checked, so to speak. So it can be a really difficult, I know she struggles with it in her profession, and I know that's probably not uncommon.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, you've both given us a lot to think about and reflect on, and I love the question that you left us with, Lucian. You know, what happens when our unconscious cultural experiences, you know, these experiences that we don't know as, you know, seen as something cultural to someone else because it's part of who we are. You know, what happens when those are exposed? You know, how does that change us? How does that change our connection to those cultural celebrations? Are there any last thoughts on that as we close?
Yes, Mike, I did have a question as far as, Lucian, we were talking about this process, this transition. Have you found in either, you know, your experience or your research, did it, for the individual whose culture has now been exposed, right? This has that little thing of their culture exposed. Did that find you questioning the authenticity of that cultural experience? Has it now become something less Mexican, less, now that it has become something for mass consumption, if that makes sense?
That's a really great question. So my point of departure really is more about psychology. And in my own experience, I think this might help show where I'm coming from. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the most popular form of therapy right now, in the 90s and then the 80s, they kind of said, if you can change your thoughts, you can change your behavior. Now they're saying you can't change your thoughts. You can notice your thoughts, but you can't change them. But noticing them does everything. It brings them to the consciousness and it sheds light on them, and you're aware of them. They're no longer the things that are making you behave without your knowing. And that's exactly what I'm suggesting happens to culture. Once we notice it, it's in light, and it's not something that's making us act unconsciously. So it doesn't mean that there's anything worse or better. It's just in a new level of information. And as an existentialist, I think, like with the story of exposing it to other people or then in dialogue with other cultures, it will evolve. And the stuff that's unconscious that affects my behavior, that's communal, that's my culture right now. So I guess you could say, I mean, they're words we're using, but you could almost say once it becomes conscious, it no longer is culture, if that's how you want to define culture. So I don't know if that illustrates it a little bit better. I don't think it makes it less important or less authentic, but it's something I'm aware of, and then I incorporate it consciously. But I think that the tough part is, in psychology, unfortunately, we know that the stuff we're conscious of, the stuff we repeat to ourselves over and over, is the stuff we really don't believe anymore. That's why we have to repeat it over and over. It's the stuff we don't know how to put into words that really make us act. And though we've been able to move knowledge from the unconscious to the conscious, we haven't figured out how to go the other direction. And I don't know that we can. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question, if anybody would like to. And again, I've unmuted, I've allowed you to unmute yourself, so you're welcome to ask a question out loud if you'd like. I'm curious, has anyone experienced this, you know, exposure, this unconscious to conscious exposure of your culture? If you can relate to these stories that are being being shared. And Crystal says all the time, yes.
Well,
And-
I mean, I have a brother, you know, I'm clearly I'm brown, right? I have a brother who's your color, Judah, with green eyes. And I have my son who looks nothing like me. He's as light as you with black hair. I mean, it just like you said, Lucian, every type of color comes out of being Latino.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's complicated. I have two sisters, and one of them is blonde and the other one's brunette, and they grew up in Mexico, and they have stories about the different way they were treated in the same family.
My good friend has bright red hair and her family's from Monterrey. So, but I do think there are a lot of redheads in Monterrey. Most of the redheads that I've met from Mexico, they said they're from Monterrey as well. So I guess that's where they keep them. But it never fails. Yeah, she has that same kind of she has to defend her Mexican identity sometimes, and it's quite odd because she speaks beautiful Spanish. She's fluent. She's very connected. Her father, that's where he was from. So yeah.
Missed a lot because I came in late, but one thing I do want to mention is that my mom is from Zacatecas, Mexico, but I was raised in the military. So I was East Coast, West Coast, even started grade school in Japan. So San Antonio, Texas is my dad's hometown. So coming back, it was coming back to live here, you know, and starting high school. It was really weird and awkward to hear the whole, especially here in San Antonio, and I don't know why, and maybe it's just me, but saying Mexican and being proud of my Mexican roots because of my mom, it was a problem for a lot of people on my dad's side of the family that were Tejanos. So, you know, so it's kind of like, oh, we're not Mexican. I'm like, well, yeah, yes, you are of Mexican descent. So, and in essence, you are Mexican, but yes, we're all American, you know. So I always had that conversation. But even still to this day, I even have some people on my dad's side of the family, oh no, we're not Mexican, we're Spanish. And I'm like, yes, you are possibly, you know, you have some Spanish in you, but you know, you're also Mexican. It's like, I'm always fighting with my family, like, why are you trying to deny that you're Mexican? What's wrong being Mexican? And even here at Northeast Lakeview College, when I walked around and you know, when I did my ancestry, and I was telling everybody, hey, guess what? I'm 10% African, you know, and they're all like, Ophelia, calm down, you know, and I'm just like, well, and of course, I'm Indigenous, 47%, and I'm Mexican. So when I say the word Mexican around people, they're like, what are you saying? I'm like, what's wrong saying Mexican? Is there something wrong saying Mexican? Is there something wrong saying Black? I mean, I'm like, so I don't know why people are so uncomfortable using the word. I've never been uncomfortable with it because, you know, I visited during the holidays to Kansas where my grandparents migrated, and that's when I was surrounded by my Mexican culture. So coming back here to San Antonio, and I've lived here since high school, so it's already been like 30 years, so I probably already get, you know, aged myself. But it's just odd that I still struggle with that with my own family, let alone, you know, in the community. So I think that's very interesting. Hopefully I didn't say too much or talk too much, but that's what I'm thinking about when I think about commodification, even though I've never used that word before.
Thank you for sharing that, Ophelia.
Mhm.
And I think that just that topic itself, you know, that tension in a family, you know, that
Yes.
deserves its own discussion, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah, and you got to that a little bit, Lucian, in your talk. You were sharing stories of, you know, sort of the uncomfortableness that people had in Minnesota. They wanted to talk to you and engage with you, and they felt like they were being offensive in some way by asking you about your culture.
That's right. And it also made me think of something Dr. Castillo said. We had a garage sale, a rummage sale one time. And this one very well-meaning white friend of mine came running up with a figurine she found. And she said, we can't sell this, it's racist, it's racist. And it was one of those typical figurines that Mexicans ourselves make of the guy that's like sleeping with the sombrero. You know,
yeah.
she's like, this is racist, it's stereotypical. And I thought, but we make it ourselves. Could it still be? Could it still be? And that speaks to what Dr. Castillo was saying.
Society changes the line every other year or whatever, so it could be later on, you never know.
We were talking about naming and families. I couldn't have been the only one whose grandfather said that we were descendant from Spanish kings and queens. I
Yes.
could be the only one that got that.
Right.
I get it all the time on my side of the family, but luckily the interesting thing now is like with the ancestry and doing the research and finally somebody else's tree populating in with mine, I've discovered, okay, yes, my great grandfather, Quirino Mata, married some Carlota Granados from the Canary Islands. Okay, it's in there somewhere, but that doesn't mean you're Spanish and you're from Spain. You know, we are mestizos, we are mixed. That's why, you know, we're Mexican. Hello. So I have an aunt that's like, do not bring the subject up around Ophelia because she goes off on a tangent. And I'm like, well, because, you know, it's fifth generation, maybe, you know, you're Spanish. So I think it's interesting, but I've learned a lot and I'm trying to teach my family. So I start with them before I can even start with the community, but I definitely would love to promote, you know, during cultural events or even during International Education Week. I want to promote Mexico. And I love that we have an international education program for study abroad that's going to hopefully make and go to Mexico, so that's the country that's nearest to us. Let's go visit, let's learn how beautiful it is and appreciate it, people, you know, so I'm all for it.
Thank you, Ophelia.
Mhm.
Dr. Castillo or, you know, Lucian Lopez, do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share before we close? Okay. I want to thank those of you who joined us today. I especially want to thank Crystal Willis-Cortinez for helping me put this together. She's a part of our History and Heritage Committee that organized this event today. And then especially thank you to the students and the faculty and Ophelia who joined in today. We appreciate you. So I've captured the banner IDs from the students who did join. Thank you for sending those to me. And we'll actually have a drawing for some NLC prizes. I know you didn't know about that, but your banner IDs will be entered into a drawing after this. So again, thank you all, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for putting it on.
everyone.
Wonderful.